John Vest is the Extension Agent for Floyd County with the Virginia Cooperative Extension. His expertise helps novice and experienced farmers produce quality livestock and crops throughout our region. John has offered to share his experiences with our audience and provide them with the knowledge to keep agriculture strong. This is the Ag Show with John Vest.
Welcome, viewers. We're back inside today, as you may notice. We're not out in the orchard doing our pruning in the cold and the wind, largely because several of my viewers actually, with their wishes for snowfall, received their wish this past Sunday. And so with the flurries blowing today and everything kind of a wet falling situation outside, we've moved indoors to talk and enjoy some discussions about planting the garden. When it comes to planting the garden, this is something that I oftentimes will tell visitors to the Extension office or even those individuals that call. The earlier we try to tackle this process, the better. It's one of those situations that we oftentimes don't think about until exactly this time of year, when that green grass fever is hitting and the days have now jumped to we're going to have some longer days, and that outdoors is calling us to get back out in the garden situation. And many of us will quickly move to the box stores and want to run out and grab our plants and seeds and go to planting. And I'll just say it's one of the leading contributors to garden failure. Particularly in our region or areas of Southwest Virginia, where based on either our elevation or our tendency to have a later frost date, can largely result in at least our initial crop failure. And something that we ought to think about when it comes to garden planting really is that last frost date. For us here in Floyd County in the New River Valley proper, our last frost date falls on May the 15th. Interestingly enough, it's something that if we would look back at the weather data for several of the past seasons, I could actually show you a killing frost or freeze that's occurred from the 19th through the 21st in our area, in our viewing area. So when it comes to planting that garden or planting that garden out, my biggest suggestion to anyone in our area is be patient. I know the grass fever is calling us all and want to get out there and start those preparations, but now is a good time to come indoors and to discuss and think about some of those planning things that really should be reviewed from last year's situation. What contributed to our problems, what contributed to our successes, and let's get some of that down on paper and planned out so we can ensure that this garden season is just as successful. When it comes to deciding the garden and what we're going to actually plant out this particular season, it always boils back to that same question as to when should I start? And fortunately, regardless of where you're at and whether you experience a late frost or freeze date as opposed to others maybe off the mountain or lower in elevation, we all are very fortunate in Southwest Virginia that there's very little that we can't grow. We have that season and that capability of growing a wide selection and variety of plants. One advantage to visiting your local extension office and having that conversation with your extension agent and your neighbors, invite them all down at some point to really look and make some decisions about the garden season, is that there are a number of various publications that not just your Virginia Extension Service, but your neighboring cooperative extension services from each state have put together with regards to what really works well to grow certain vegetables versus others, and what are their cold and heat tolerances, when is their planting schedule from seeding versus transplanting, to their actual harvest schedules. And for that example, in that example alone, this source right here, this is the New River Valley Vegetable Planting Guide. It lists all the dates. We have these available at the Extension office. And it's not just a one-page tell-all, but actually front and back takes you through a majority of garden vegetables that are easily grown here in Southwest Virginia, and helps you make those decisions on when is the ideal time for me to get my garden placed out. Now, when we're talking time, since that tends to be our first question usually, I like to suggest for folks to work backwards if they can. If we recognize that regardless of all that green grass out there and the trees in bloom and the beauty that surrounds us, if we'll recognize that our last freeze or frost is still going to occur in that third week in May, there is the point where I start to back up. And I'll look at what those crops are, or what those particular varieties are that will do well in my given situation. For instance, we get phone calls all the time. I know our production editor, Josh, he's always asking about his potatoes. One of those questions is what gets planted first? Am I looking to get my potatoes in the ground by St. Patty's Day or through April the 15th? What are those situations that maybe contributed to my success last year or my failure last year? And this is where, like I said, working backwards helps me make a planning decision that may be beneficial in this current season. For example, if I've used a particular area in the garden for planting my potatoes year after year, and year after year, those diseases and or insects that have come to visit and take advantage of that new meal that they're enjoying, like the potato beetle, Colorado potato beetle, they tend to build in population year after year or season after season. And just imagine if I did a little bit of garden planning and decided instead of planting super early, what would occur if I simply planted my potatoes 3 weeks late? Still within that window of opportunity to have everything satisfactory take off and grow well for me. But just like last year, when the Colorado potato beetles came up and started eating away at my potato vines because they were emerging following my last and previous year's crops, suddenly there's that opportunity where by planting late, the insects for this season could emerge, have maybe nothing to feed on, and then my potatoes arrive a few weeks later with regards to their vines, and I've reduced or eliminated one of those problem situations in the garden. So whether we're thinking of timing with regards to insects and disease pressures, or we're thinking about timing with which one of those vegetables or crops prefer cool season versus warm season, all these are things that go into our planning process. Another example is just that, talking about those vegetables that prefer cool season weather, our broccoli, our cauliflower, our cabbage, those things, even peas that do really well and are tolerant of light frosts and things. Those and their transplanted opportunities are certainly earlier than those when we think of planting a legume like beans, and certainly our corn ground or planting the corn in the garden, which is usually one of our latter or most late crops to grow in. Each one has the benefit in their tolerance to cold weather, and planting them accordingly and making our way through the garden is not a single day weekend planting process. It's one that should be approached with an understanding that there's an ideal planting date for every vegetable you choose to grow. As we continue discussing planting the garden, like I mentioned, this is a job when it's best tackled early. There's some additional reasons why we choose to plan the garden early. Largely because when it comes to remembering what occurred last year, if I haven't written it down in my small notebook, it's pretty hard to recollect a year later all the things that I would like to really have made a notation on, or the experiences that occurred in last year's garden, certainly I'd like to remember them in the planting process this year. So if planting the garden can occur certainly in the early fall, early winter period, that gives us an opportunity to, having gone freshly through the last year's season, to have hopefully jotted these notes down and put these particular situations to paper so that we have an opportunity to refer back to them for this season. Secondly, the fall season is a main period in which many of our seed companies are producing and or looking at their selection of materials that they're going to be mailing to you and getting out in the early spring of the year. And it's sometimes nice to collectively get some of those resources together and start making some decisions on which varieties of seed really performed well for you. I know every year we tend to experience a particular seed that we really like, or a crop that we really like. And in other situations, we may consider it to have been a failure. That snap bean had every string in the world still attached when it came time to be processing. And it's one of those things that we'll know better in our current season if we've jotted that information down. Like I said, in the spring of the year, those garden catalogs start rolling out with all the selection and the newest and the best with regards to what the companies are suggesting for your planting. In every garden catalog, it's important to pay attention to their charts and to the materials inside that help indicate to you where their planting locations are. For us in Floyd County, with most of us above that 1,800 feet in elevation, we typically fall in a 6A to 6B planting hardiness zone. So once again, due to our elevation and living up here on the plateau, it is a situation where the added cool season and stuff may limit our season to some degree, and we have to make our choices based on the longevity or how long it takes to grow individual varieties. So in the case of corn, for instance, we may range from an early corn of 85 to 90 days all the way up to 115, 120 days. Same with some of our cucurbits with regards to pumpkin production. We're not going to be planting them in the early season of the garden. We're going to be spacing them out, always backing up from our intended harvest date so that we can hopefully grow the crop in proximity to when we would like to harvest it. So folks, when we're back inside here and planting this garden, like I've mentioned, I really prefer to work somewhat backwards in order to schedule and plan out the necessary components of when my crops are going in. A lot of that is largely due to the insect and disease presence as they tend to build in similar locations from year to year. The importance of gardening or gardening within a given location cannot be stressed enough with regards to making all those tools that are available to us in an integrated pest management plan. That's a long term given for something we affectionately call IPM. But for those of us that want to reduce our chemical input in the garden and or use or those organic products or remedies, as well as my conventional folks that do use chemicals from time to time, usually as a last resort, it's important for us to all realize that we as individuals have several tools in our IPM toolbox that can best accomplish a healthy garden by the end of the season, or certainly by our harvest date. For instance, you and I have the ability to use cultural controls, those things that you and I decide on here in the planning process to make sure that we're not faced with that insect problem or that disease problem the following year. One of the ideal things to think in the planning phase is what we've done with regards to garden sanitation from the previous year. Did we actually rake or remove the debris? Do we burn that material and scatter it back over the garden as an ash resource? Did we plow or till that material in so that it can start to compost and replenish the soil that is there? In any of those scenarios, the sanitation is incredibly important so we don't have that potential for insect and or disease carryover till this season that we're beginning. So with regards to trying to get the garden spot cleaned up, that's a major portion of our planning process. If it hasn't been done by this time of year, now is the time that we're thinking about it. For those of us that do in our organic choices make the decision to burn and have that material remain there on site to be incorporated from its ash content into the soil, just do keep in mind, always pay attention to the authorities and the laws and the bans in place so we don't have to call out the locals to deal with any unwanted situations. Now, that said, the sanitation is just one component. Let's talk about some of the other things with the garden location itself. If we're relatively new to the gardening process, you may be looking in one of those situations where you're trying to think of, hey, I'm going to take this section of the yard or a new portion of ground. If you've been gardening in a similar or same location for a number of years, you pretty much maybe answered a lot of these concerns. But with every garden site location, there's various things that come into consideration that will certainly make us more successful. Sunlight's the big one. Anytime we can provide that garden with as much sunlight throughout the given day, the better off we typically are for fruit and vegetable production. That being said, if you have a tree line and or structures that potentially shade an area of the garden, or if you have them in proximity to those areas that toward the end of the day, that shade line starts to cross our growing area or grow zone. In many cases, that could inhibit certain varieties from doing well. At the same time, it's our opportunity to look at and see there are those varieties that actually don't like the heated afternoon sun that we typically experience in June, July, and August, right smack dab in our growing season, that from 2 p.m., afternoon, hot western exposure tends to really work on the crops or the varieties that we tend to grow. And if we have a garden that tends to have a little bit of shade on one side, we can consider those varieties that may do better if placed in that particular location of the garden. They get the morning sun, the early afternoon, and by that point, we have an opportunity to give them a rest as they start into the actual heat and dry period of the day. Additionally, there's all kinds of things with regards to water and wind and proximity to those plants and trees that don't like things around them. Many of the viewers may know or may not the significance of planting in and around a walnut tree. Walnuts have an allelopathic response. They produce a material in their system that helps prevent competition from other garden varieties, certainly, from growing around their base. So if you have a particular garden spot picked out, but it's in proximity to that walnut tree or in location up to 60 feet away, you may still actually experience the impacts from the allelopathy that's resulting from that tree having either been there from years prior or that it's currently there and continuing to try to reduce its competition with those things around it. So it may be additional trees. If we think about our black locust and our certainly some of our more invasive species, if we have a garden in proximity to those trees, we might find underground root systems and or their tendency to be sprouting up and in our garden soil to really be an kind of an unrecognized weed problem. So when it comes to planning the location, full sun if possible. I prefer an area that is not going to be have a lot of tree line or material around the garden, preferably. And finally, one that is going to provide me access. Because if I don't get out and take the time to find my enjoyment going back and forth to the garden, to doing my weeding, to doing my investigative work and monitoring and looking for insects and disease, if I don't go out there and do my necessary suckering or pruning, whatever it may be for that variety, it's those repeat visits that need to be enjoyable. And if I'm having to truck myself all the way down to the garden and all the way back up the hill, in many of those situations, it becomes more like a chore than a gardening pastime. So once again, when it comes to the planning, I like to move or have the garden in closer proximity, certainly, to the area that I would like to work in and enjoy, usually closer to the house. That too brings into account a couple things that oftentimes help us out. Number one, my water source is usually closer to the house. And we all know, regardless of what irrigation system we choose to use in our gardening, whether it be overhead or pulling out the hose, or even if it's carrying buckets of water, the fact of the matter is making that trek back and forth, providing that water is a needed resource when it comes to gardening in June, July, and August. Secondly, it tends to allow us an area that, with the regular activity that tends to go on at the house, it may keep our furry critters at bay. So with those of us with problems with deer and raccoons and even bear in this part of the world, it is an advantage to sometimes consider the movement or the relocation of the garden into closer proximity to the home. So now I can water easily. I have the added activity with my friend Spot the dog, or the cats and the family that is interacting in and around the home. All that goes into play to really kind of keeping some of that furry wildlife away from the garden. Does it work every time? No, certainly not. And we oftentimes from the university will preach a little bit about exclusion. If you do find a garden that has to be away from the home or moved out further onto the property to find that ideal soil location and sunlight that you're looking for, in many cases, that fence or fence structure and exclusion is what we look for to keep the animals out. Having just mentioned exclusion, I think this would be an important point for any new gardener, as well as some of our older gardeners looking to relocate the actual garden, that have experienced the pest pressures from wildlife. Many of our studies that have been undertaken in our land-grant institutions like Virginia Tech and VSU, Virginia State University here in Virginia, but also those in other states such as Michigan, have actually run and done the research to see how deer and other wildlife tend to move in around the gardens and the crops that we like to grow, how they access those particular areas. And what an interesting thing to understand is that given the opportunity, and for many of us in Floyd County, we certainly experience the deer situation. Deer, in many cases, if there is an exclusionary fence built around our garden, as long as there is ample location for them to move and around the garden. Deer are not grazers. They're really not like sheep or cattle. They're more like goats in that they love to browse. So they're going to take a bite and take a step, take a bite and take a step. They tend to move through an area. And unless they've gotten a taste for what's inside, they might actually never pressure a fence or make an attempt to go in or get inside the fence. That being said, what we've learned from the research is that in 90+% of the time, deer do not like or do not take the jump as their initial way of gaining entry into an enclosed area. In many cases, like I said, 90% of the time, whether it be female, male deer, baby deer in general, they'll go to their knees and actually try to make their way under your bottom fence wire or exclusionary point. With that said, if we can ensure that our lowest most wire on whatever design that we choose to use is set at about 8 inches, that goes a long way to reducing that deer's desire to go to its knees and try to make its way under. That doesn't mean that they can't be pressured. Certainly wildlife that's being chased by a dog or chased by something else, or that maybe has been run from a vehicle out of the road and has made its way up onto your property. If that fence or that garden exclusionary point is in close proximity to where they're running from, that's when we create the jump. That's when we create their unintended desire in many cases to find themselves inside once everything is calmed down. So in terms of gardening and planning our space, if we can move the garden approximately 35 to 40 feet off the edge of a yard or a fence line or a wood line situation, where as they start to come out of their natural habitat and they experience an open area in which to travel between that and the next fence, in many cases they do not pressure the fence. It's when fences are pushed up against a wood line or we're certainly always trying to maximize our space, but in doing so and adding that additional space up to that wood line or to that access point, now when they're fronted with it, or if they're being pressured from outside that area, making their way in, you're going to force the jump into the particular area. So I would encourage anyone, whether we're planting the garden for a garden space or a larger commercial field, or even my Christmas tree growers and things, to think about making the decision to allow a buffer zone in and around our exclusionary fence that allows the wildlife to traverse the property and not be pressured to make their way in the initial fence location. I'd also like to take this opportunity to ask the viewers. It's always nice to hear, I certainly hear from many of you from an extension perspective, but with regards to this segment, our ag show, I'd like for growers, if you have that opportunity, and or as residential landowners, if you have a particular interest and you think it would be applicable to the ag show, to communicate or reach out to us so that we have an opportunity to maybe take your questions and address them right here on the air. I think that'd be an excellent opportunity or to line up those segments that will best address you, myself, the neighbors that we have in our community, so we can all benefit from each other's questions. So once again, appreciate the chance for everybody to visit and view the segment today, and we look forward to bringing more to you in the future.